What's up guys, it's your favorite Kiwi coach. Give me 6 months of your time and I'll give you the best golf swing of your life. So welcome back to the channel. If you guys are new to this channel, we do a bunch of videos about swing analysis of our clients before and afters. We do videos like this where we talk about topics like the GG swing, and then also we just do random golf instructional videos about all sorts of topics. So if you're interested in getting your golf swing better, well, this is the perfect channel for you, so definitely make sure to go subscribe. In this particular video, we are going to be talking about the GG swing. I know it was very popular about a couple years ago here in Japan, maybe lost a little bit of popularity, but there's still plenty of you guys interested about the GG swing. So if you want to know the highlights of the GG swing, this will be a perfect video because we're going to be going over all of that and visually showing you the highlights as well. And then also the very beginning of this video, we're going to give you a brief history of George Genkis, kind of how his theory came to be. So let's go ahead and jump in. So we're not going to be giving George Genkis' whole life story in this particular video, but we will start off right when he started to get popular. So right around 2016, 2017, I believe, that's when he really started to blow up on Instagram. It's right around the time where actually my friend, Gabriel Ryder, who owns this YouTube channel called Movement Towards Improvement, started to go out to his driving range and film his lessons with his juniors. Ultimately, that led to a partnership where they started a YouTube channel together, as well they started a membership site together. And then through that time, they filmed a bunch of his lessons, posting them on YouTube. They started to blow up because he had really interesting theories. He started to get some really crazy before and after results, which not a lot of YouTube instructors were doing at the time. And then ultimately, on the business side of things, some things went sour between the relationship, and that's when George Genkis parted ways and started George Genkis Golf, which we now all know today. So now that you guys know the basics of George Genkis, let's start to get into the highlights of his theory. So to really start to understand George Genkis and his golf swing, you need to understand the typical golf faults that a lot of high-end junior golfers were having at that time. So this was during the time where, you know, the Hank Haneys of the world, the Butch Harmons, the Ledbetters, the Mike Binders were incredibly popular, especially in the junior golf phase, right? Because they all had great tour players, so all the junior golfers wanted to get coached by them. But really, the issue that a lot of these junior golfers were having were in transition, they were actually keeping the body really, really closed. They were sliding the hips forward, and a lot of them were getting underneath the plane like this. They're getting really stuck and then having really massive flips through the golf balls. And all the junior golfers struggled with big pushes out to the right and then big hooks off to the left. So George Genkis, he really created his theory to solve that issue. He wanted to get rid of what we call the early extension and the massive hip slide. That was something that he hated, he didn't like to see in the golf swing, and I completely understand why, because so many junior golfers struggle with what we just talked about. So keeping that in mind, that's really where he based his swing history around. Let's start to get into some of the major points of setup that are really unique to the GG swing. Now at the time, as well as at the time of filming this video, George's setup is definitely, I'd say, more of an outcast version of the setup in the golf instructional world in America. But when he talks about it, it does have some sense to it, and I understand where he's trying to go with it. So to be able to understand why he wanted to set up this way, let me start to explain kind of the typical instructors of the time, how they would get their clients to set up. So typically at the time you were taught to stand up straight like this, then from here add a little bit of flex in the knees, and then bend over from the hips about this amount, which is really getting the upper body over the golf ball. And then from here, go ahead and set up. So as you can see, the lower back angle is actually quite acute, right? It's quite a big angle. And then what would happen from here for most players would, on the backswing, they would move in towards the golf ball more and get a lot of pressure on the toes. And then in transition, they would start to early extend and move this way because they had so much pressure on the toes throughout the backswing. So what George created was a setup to where it would have the opposite effect. So at setup, what George wanted you to do, instead of having the pelvis tilt this way, which is tilting the pelvis down in anterior pelvic tilt, he actually wanted the pelvis to be what he called underneath you, which just means that you almost had the pelvis more level and almost in posterior pelvic tilt where the front end would be up. So he called it SHITTY posture. I'm not going to cuss on this channel, but he called it bad posture, essentially is what he called it. So that would look something like this. So you almost want to get into this posture where you feel like you're slumped over like this. The shoulders are kind of slumped over. The pelvis is underneath you. And then from there, you would go ahead and set up to the golf ball and look something like this. Now, at the time, as well as now, it's a quite controversial setup, which has actually been proven to be, not necessarily what great players do, but I understand the point behind it. The main goal was if we could get it set up a little bit more this way, what would happen is on the downswing now, the players would naturally want to almost push the pelvis back out like this, and that would get rid of the early extension. That's really the logic that he had behind it. And obviously with his players, you could see when you look at the before and afters, even though they set up that way and it looked quite strange, they actually did change and got rid of the early extension. So you could argue, even though it was unconventional, it definitely had some effect to the downswing and it was working with what he was telling them. The next unique movement I want to talk about is going to be the trail elbow, which means this back elbow movement on the back swing. So what George was teaching was somewhere right around after P2, he wanted to see this right elbow actually move towards what's called internal rotation towards the top of the swing, which get the elbow in this position. Now, the reason why he wanted this to happen is because he quoted it caused a stretch shortened cycle, which is a fancy way of saying if you can get your elbow to move this way, it's going to naturally want to react this way on transition, which should then make it turn easier to flatten the club shaft, which is going to be another point we'll talk about later in this video because that's something he really likes to see. But he said it's going to create that stretch shortened cycle. It's going to make it easier for the elbow to move this way. It's going to be more of a natural throwing motion, which then in turn is going to allow you to pick up more and more speed. Now, this is something that's not necessarily been proven and not necessarily something I agree with. If you guys watch my videos, you probably know, but this is just kind of what he would think about. So in terms of applying this in the swing, George would talk about a one-piece takeaway to right around here. So really, you're not twisting the club shaft. You're not really moving the elbow this way yet. But then after the takeaway, as you go up to the top of the swing, you then in turn want to internally rotate the elbow like this to the top of the swing. And this is exactly the elbow position when he first started out teaching. Nowadays, it's actually slightly different the way that he teaches the elbows, which I won't get into in this video. But when he started out with GG swing tips, that's exactly what he was teaching. One piece takeaway to P2, pretty much a normal traditional takeaway. And then after that, allow the elbow to internally rotate all the way up to the top. That is a very unique elbow movement that you don't see a lot of people teach. Now, the next point I want to talk about is going to be the club shaft position at the top of the swing. Now, because George had some very popular players in Matthew Wolff and Johnny Ruiz, a lot of people thought that his instruction was teaching a massively cross the line position at the top of the swing. But if you guys actually went through and watched a lot of his GG swing tip videos, I would probably argue that 85%, maybe 90% of his clients had a really traditional top of swing position with the club shaft that was laid off. So during that time, I can't speak to now, but during that time of GG swing tips, he actually taught most of his clients, yes, to get this elbow internally rotated, but he wanted them to rotate the forearms to where the club shaft would be on this laid off position. That's what he taught a lot of his players. And just go watch his videos back then, and you'll see exactly what I mean. A lot of his players had a more traditional top of swing. Now, that doesn't mean that some of his players like Johnny Ruiz or Matthew Wolff did have a cross the line, right? Plenty of his players also had that as well. But I would say by far, this is definitely a myth that you're seeing taught here in Japan. Not a lot of his players back then actually had a cross the line position at the top. So even though we're getting this elbow this way, he taught his players to rotate the forearm like this to get it in a more laid off position because he said that it would be easier to most likely shallow the club shaft and get into a better club shaft position on the downswing. So that's a point I wanted to bring up. It's not necessarily a unique point because again, he didn't teach it to everyone, but it's a myth that you've been hearing here in Japan and it's actually not correct if you go back and take a look at the GG swing tip videos. So now the next topic I want to talk about, and this is by far, at least in Japan, what George is most known for, and that's going to be the shallowing of the golf club. So now if we go back in that time, right around the 2017, 2018 range, not a lot of instructors were actually using the term shallowing. And the main reason why, because shallowing typically in the American or the English language is not referred to as a motion. It's typically referred to as an event that is occurring, right? So basically this is shallow water, which just means there's not a lot of water until you get to the bottom where you can feel the sand. So it's very interesting that he used the word shallowing because typically it's not referred to as a motion, and that's not necessarily the correct way to use the word. However, George started to use the word. All of a sudden, Google SEO of shallowing started to go up, so all the other instructors had to use the term because they wouldn't get a lot of views if they didn't use the term. So all of a sudden, the term became mainstream, even though technically, grammatically speaking, it's not the correct term to use for what he's explaining. So the correct term would actually be flattening, would be a better term, because typically in the American language, when we talk about flattening, we are talking about a motion, and that motion is typically moving an object from more of an erect position to more of a flatter position on the ground. So technically, this motion that he talks about when he talks about shallowing is not necessarily shallowing in the American language, it's actually flattening. But that's more so of a grammatical argument, so honestly, guys, I could care less. If you want to call it shallowing, but just be clear that you're describing, what you're describing. So let's get into the shallowing. So for everyone who watched the George Gankas videos, you typically heard about this natural shallowing motion, right? Basically, the essence behind the natural shallowing motion was you got up to the top of the swing, maybe here or here, it doesn't really matter. But if you use the lower body correctly, the club shaft would automatically start to flatten or shallow, and you would get into the correct downswing position if you use the lower body correctly. So let me kind of break down what that actually is occurring and what does that mean. So do you actually move the lower body correctly and the club shaft shallows? Not necessarily. Even if you feel like you're doing nothing with the grip, nothing with the hands, you are actually still doing a torque to cause that club shaft to flatten. What happens here is when I move the lower body in the way that George wants you to move, what happens here is this pelvis is actually going to start to raise the right side as it rotates. That actually is going to force the hands kind of out and maybe even slightly almost up, which then in turn gets the club shaft to lay down. So when it comes to George's natural shallowing, if you do move the body the way that he wants you to move, that will actually then in turn cause a torque with the hand and the grip end, which then in turn twists the club shaft. So can you call it natural shallowing? I guess you could. It's kind of a catchy term and it makes a lot of sense for the average golfer. So if it works for you, it works for you, just do it. But in real, it's not natural. You are actually still torquing the club to do that. It's not just automatically occurring because the body moved. So I hope you guys get that. When he talks about the natural shallowing, he's really talking about how you move the pelvis and the upper body will then in turn torque the club to then flatten the club shaft. So that's what he talks about when he's talking about natural shallowing. All right, that's it for you guys on YouTube, but before you guys click off, let me give you some quick wrap-up points. So the main point I'm trying to get across in this particular video is a lot of what George Gankas says was really taboo at the time, but definitely had some relevancy to what the best players were doing at the time. So a lot of the moves that he talked about really revolutionized the golf industry in America for a positive note. However, a lot of his motions were really realistically not true as well, and not a lot of the great players did them. So when it comes to George Gankas and the GG swing model, I think bits and parts are really good, bits and parts are not very good. So if you try to do all of the motions, you're probably going to struggle. If you pick and choose the best motions, which, personally I think our theory and as well a lot of other American golf instructors nowadays, their theories do, I think you'll be really good and better off. If you guys are watching the Japanese GG swing, well, I'm just going to tell you now, probably stop watching it because a lot of what they talk about is really, really flawed and it comes from misinterpretation and mistranslation. So make sure to avoid that. If you guys are struggling with your swing, especially if you guys are doing the GG swing right now, why don't you go check out the Kwiwi Coach 6-month program. We just launched our new instructor, Hiroshi-san. He has his waiting list. He's taking about 10 people on that waiting list right now. So if you sign up and you take a lesson with them, you automatically get a free lifetime Kiwi Platinum membership. That's over 260 videos you'll get access to. And then also you'll have the chance to win a free 9-hole round lesson with myself and Hiroshi. So go check out his waiting list down below. Let me know in Discord group if you have some other instructors you guys want me to